Is Venezuela's socialist revolution under siege? Anti-government protests convulse parts of the country almost a year after the death of the leader Hugo Chavez. But what's driving the unrest? This is Inside Story. It's a country with the world's largest oil reserves, but with one of the planet's highest rates of inflation. It's where the socialist dreams of the late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez took hold. But almost a year after his death, the country appears dangerously divided over his legacy. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Welcome to Inside Story. Parts of Venezuela are in the grip of protests fueled by shortages and crime. The focus of the protests is the current president, Nicolas Maduro, the man personally picked by Chavez to represent his socialist vision at the ballot box. But is that vision under threat? Rachel Levin begins our coverage with this report from the capital, Caracas.
The anti-government protests continue in the Venezuelan capital, this time marching and venting their frustration at state television. While they took to the streets, the headquarters of the opposition party was raided by unidentified men. In this security video distributed by the opposition, which cannot be independently verified, what appears to be armed men forced their way in. This congresswoman who was there at the time describes the scene.
The men forced us to go down on our knees. They said they were looking for the national coordinator, Carlos Vecchio. They knocked down the door, they were armed and they left.
The government has turned up diplomatic pressure and nationalist sentiment by expelling 3 U.S. diplomats. President Nicolas Maduro accuses them of aiding groups that are trying to overthrow his government.
They will be forced to leave the sovereign and independent homeland of Venezuela in the next 48 hours because of actively participating in the organization and promotion of these groups which attempted to generate violence in the country.
The U.S. rejected the allegation, saying the country's political future is for the Venezuelan people to decide. But for many, the growing political tension is doing little to ease the financial crisis gripping the country. And for people like Andrea Patiño, it's getting harder and harder to support her family.
We can't find chicken, meat, milk, butter, oil, sugar, or coffee. You can't find any basic products.
With the opposition refusing to give up and the government increasing pressure, there's no clear sign of when, how, or even if this political crisis might end soon. Rachel Levin, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
Much to discuss here then. Let's bring in our guests to get their analysis on what's going on in Venezuela. In New York, we have Gregory Wilpert, a specialist on Venezuelan affairs and founder of VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Joining us from Caracas, Girish Gupta, a journalist covering events in Venezuela. And in St. Louis in the U.S., Daniel Hellinger, a professor at Webster University and author of the book Venezuelan Politics in the Chavez Era, Class, Polarization and Conflict. Girish Gupta, first of all, then, we are seeing headlines that suggest all of Venezuela is aflame, completely consumed by revolutionary turmoil. But can you perhaps put these demonstrations into some context for us?
Yeah, we are seeing flames, but they're not engulfing the whole country at all. We've seen protests across the country for about 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks now, and over the last 6 or 7 days they've hit Caracas, and they've hit Caracas hard. But as you say, it's not engulfing the city, it's not engulfing the country. It's very specific parts of the city, a region known as Chacao and Altamira, which is a wealthier part of town. And this is very telling because, yes, there are lots of people on the streets, but it's thousands. It's not tens of thousands. It's not hundreds of thousands. And those are the numbers that we saw over a decade ago when there was the short coup here. And that's why it's difficult to see that this will turn into something bigger. But then we do have this showdown today between the government and the opposition. We'll have to see how that goes.
Professor Hellinger, though, one opposition blogger wrote the following: middle-class protests in middle-class areas on middle-class middle-class themes by middle-class people are not a challenge to the Chavista power system. They're part of the Chavista power system. And there's also a suggestion that this is perhaps more of an opposition coup against itself. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a pretty good analysis because, your reporter referred to the opposition, but in fact, Enrique Capriles, who was their candidate in the last election, and who himself has, I think, unwisely called people out into the streets, for example, after the election in April, this time is counseling a lot more moderation. And I keep in touch both with government and opposition figures in Venezuela, and a lot of people in the opposition are very distraught at the way in which the most extreme sectors of the opposition associated with the party that was raided, that your reporter referred to regarding the raid, that the more moderate sectors of the opposition, I think, are not at all happy that the more extreme sectors of the opposition are trying to provoke a crisis, which in the end will probably unify the supporters of the government.
Right, so let's run through then the key players in what's going on. Obviously, we have Nicolas Maduro, a one-time bus driver. He was elected president of Venezuela in April of last year. He was Hugo Chavez's hand-picked successor at the ballot box, but only scraped to victory by less than 2 percentage points. Leading the demonstrations with a call for the government's exit, Leopoldo Lopez, hardline leader within the opposition alliance, Harvard graduate. He's mobilized a section of the opposition, but is facing arrest on charges of murder, terrorism and conspiracy. And then the other important figure in the opposition movement, Enrique Capriles, who narrowly lost the presidency to Maduro. His support has been waning, though, among some protesters who've lost patience with his attempt to suggest a more moderate leadership. Gregory Wilpert, let's go through them, these different figures. Leopoldo Lopez, first of all. Who is he, and what's he trying to achieve? I mean, clearly he's called these protests La Salida, the exit. What's he trying to do here?
Well, first of all, I think he's trying to take advantage of the unhappiness that exists in the population with inflation and the shortages of basic products, as was mentioned in the earlier report. And so that's one of the things. The other factor is that, of course, he's also, in a sense, staging, as was mentioned earlier, also is staging an internal coup against the leadership of the opposition, trying to, so to speak, gain the upper hand by taking a leadership position without really consulting with them and without their participation. So I think that these things are coming together. Ultimately, as the blog analysis said, it's probably not going to succeed, and it's actually going to divide the opposition even more than it has been. So it's really I think a strategy that doesn't have much use for the opposition. But the fact is that they are trying to take advantage of these economic problems that currently exist in Venezuela.
Professor Hellinger, though, is this purely, though, an argument about tactics, whether to respect the democratic process, the election, or not, or is it actually about policy? Enrique Capriles, the mainstream opposition leader, has certainly been trying to suggest he's a sort of Chavez light, that he will preserve many of Chavez's policies. Is that part of the fault line as well, though?
Well, it is part of the fault line, although I do think that I see a deeper problem here, which is the oil economy. I mean, the country still depends on oil for 95% of its export earnings. They're now consuming 800,000 barrels. They produce 3 million barrels a day. They're consuming 800,000 barrels a day themselves, producing it at a drastic loss. They're paying China in oil at 200,000 barrels a day of exports. That's all export earnings that are not available. And I do think that Maduro's economic team has not been a team. So the government side is kind of making things worse. But on the other hand, this reminds me a little bit of what's going on in Thailand. You have a government, on the one hand, that is supported by the sectors of the population that in the past have been excluded, and they are a majority. They may be a slim majority after last April's election, but they're a majority. And then you have a middle class in Caracas that wants to paint the government with some reason as incompetent and not doing a very good job, and sort of suggesting, in a sense, campaigning against democracy. So it's eerily kind of like more like Thailand than like Ukraine, because the protesters in the streets really are the anti-democratic side.
Girish Gupta, though, it all suggests, though, that this is a bit of a gift to Nicolas Maduro, that he was facing pressure and trouble. And now I suppose he can just say, well, look, the right-wing oligarchs and everyone are up to their old tricks again. The anti-democratic oligarchs are up to their old tricks again. They're the enemy.
Well, that's right. Enrique Capriles was very smart in realising that Hugo Chavez was liked by people in Venezuela, and that the opposition, to get anywhere, has to admit that and understand why that is. Now, Enrique Capriles, he may well be this oligarch. His family owns a chain of cinemas here, for example. But he did understand that. He went into the slums. He would act like Chavez did, and he would persuade them that yes, there was some good in Chavez, and I will continue that good. But this country isn't necessarily working as it should, and I can do better. Now, he didn't win 2 elections. He failed to win against Hugo Chavez by quite a wide margin, and then failed to win against Maduro last April by a very small margin. And that's meant that the opposition as a whole has begun, not totally, but has begun to lose interest in Enrique Capriles. And that's now when Leopoldo Lopez can come in, and this is the divide that you talk about. Leopoldo Lopez has come in, he's much more radical, and people are telling me, well, we want something to happen, and at least Leopoldo's getting people out on the streets. However, he doesn't necessarily understand that what people want, or what some people want in this country, is a Hugo Chavez-like character.
But very quickly there, Greg Wilpert, is Leopoldo Lopez's gambit paying off? And anyway, did we actually buy that Enrique Capriles had become this Chavez-like figure, or was it just the same old backers backing him anyway? It was just kind of a political ploy?
Well, given that the election last April was so narrow, I think that many people did switch sides and ended up supporting Enrique Capriles, people who had previously supported Chavez. It still wasn't enough to win the election, but there was a significant switch. So the strategy did seem to work, which is also, I think, one of the reasons why Capriles is sticking to it. On the other hand, Leopoldo Lopez, he sees that his only hope, so to speak, as a leader to challenge Capriles is to engage in this more radical strategy.
Is it working, Greg?
To some extent he's succeeding, in the sense that the government is certainly demonizing him, I think, by putting out an arrest warrant against him. And it's dividing the opposition, though. So that's the other factor. But it's putting him certainly on the map in terms of leadership of the opposition.
But Professor Hellinger, presumably the government must be aware that if there is any crackdown by the government, they'll lose any moral authority they may have, any democratic authority that they may have. The people who benefit from the violence would be Leopoldo Lopez, wouldn't they?
You can see the ploy there. He makes himself a martyr. There's a good prospect, again, there could be violence. As Greg points out, I think quite rightly, the government has done some kind of stupid things. It's almost like echoes of 2002 when the opposition tried to overthrow Chavez and the TV stations were cooperating and refusing to show pro-Chavez demonstrations. Now, all of a sudden, you've got the government, in a sense, trying to prevent local broadcasts of opposition demonstrations. This is very foolish because you really can't control the.
Yeah, but the opposition TV stations are still open, aren't they? Again, there's a Twitter kind of thing that all the TV stations have been shut down and so on. That's not true, is it?
Oh. No, that's not true. Yeah, right, you're absolutely right to point that out. There's sometimes particularly in the American news, we get an image of a country where there's no opposition and the media can't operate. I didn't mean to say that either.
Okay.
But at the same time, I do think the government is not responding in an entirely smart way to this challenge.
I'm glad you mentioned the U.S. You can never talk about Venezuelan politics without talking a little bit about the U.S. There is always this wider dimension of the U.S. After President Maduro expelled 3 U.S. diplomats, he accused them of conspiring with opposition hardliners to stage a coup. Justifying the expulsion, Maduro said, "We are determined to risk everything to defend peace, our independence and our democracy. Let them go and conspire in Washington and leave Venezuela alone." Reports of the arrests of anti-government protesters and the warrant issued for opposition figure Leopoldo Lopez drew this response from the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. He said he was alarmed, adding these actions have a chilling effect on citizens' rights to express their grievances peacefully. Greg Wilpert, how should we look at the U.S. role, given their history of involvement with the opposition, this strange balance between promoting democracy and actively funding the opposition? Where are they now, do we think?